Ever thought pirates were just in it for the gold? Think again. These seafaring outlaws weren't just after treasure. They ruled with an iron fist, enforcing their own twisted brand of justice. Step out of line and you could find yourself facing punishments so gruesome, they'd make your blood run cold. We're talking brutal executions, sadistic tortures, and punishments so cruel they'd send a message loud and clear to anyone thinking of crossing them. So what were these nightmarish pirate punishments? Stick around as we uncover some of the most horrifying ways pirates kept control of their ships. The use of bilboes. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, if a sailor or prisoner stepped out of line, there was a good chance they'd end up in bilboes. These weren't just simple shackles. They were heavy iron bars with sliding restraints that locked around the ankles, keeping the punished person stuck in place, completely exposed and helpless. But it wasn't just about physical restraint. The real sting of the bilboes came from the humiliation. Sailors locked in them weren't hidden away. They were put on display for everyone to see, serving as a living warning to the rest of the crew. If you broke the rules, this could be you. And sometimes the punishment didn't stop at the ship. Offenders were marched out in public, adding even more shame to their sentence. Oddly enough, for all their brutality, bilboes had a small, almost ironic benefit. Unlike other restraints that cause severe swelling, bilboes kept the feet slightly elevated, preventing some of that painful swelling. But make no mistake, this was no act of kindness. It was just a cruel efficiency, ensuring the person could endure their punishment for as long as necessary. Torture. Pirates weren't just after gold and glory. Some were downright sadistic. While many raided ships for treasure, others saw cruelty as a tool of control, using sheer brutality to strike fear into their enemies. The idea was simple. If word got around that resistance led to unspeakable suffering, future targets might surrender without a fight. Torture came in many gruesome forms. Some victims were beaten mercilessly or whipped until their flesh was in tatters. Others endured excruciating methods like having cords tied around their heads and twisted tighter until their eyes bulged. One particularly cruel practice involved repeatedly dunking prisoners into the sea from a ship's yardarm, leaving them gasping for air until they either confessed or lost consciousness. Some acts of pirate cruelty were shocking even by the violent standards of the time. A Portuguese captain who had the misfortune of tossing his purse overboard rather than handing it over suffered a horrific fate. His lips were sliced off and burned before his eyes. English pirate Charles Vane, infamous for his ruthlessness, tormented captives with burning matches, leaving them permanently scarred or worse. One of the most horrifying cases involved Henry Every and his crew, who seized the Mughal treasure ship Ganges Sawai in 1695. They subjected passengers to horrific abuse before ending their lives and dumping their bodies into the sea. Another feared pirate, Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, left a trail of mutilation in his wake, once executing Dutch sailors and using their corpses for target practice. Perhaps the most sadistic of them all was Edward Ned Lowe. His name became synonymous with terror in the early 1700s, as he forced prisoners to endure grotesque punishments. One man was made to eat his own ears, while another was forced to consume his own heart. Edmund Condon, another ruthless pirate, reportedly boiled and ate the heart of a captive who had dared to resist. Pirate punishments weren't just about physical pain, they were psychological warfare. The sheer brutality ensured that even the bravest sailors thought twice before challenging them. Walking the plank. When people think of pirates, one of the first images that comes to mind is a helpless prisoner being forced to walk a narrow plank off the side of a ship, plunging into the ocean below. It's a terrifying scene often dramatized in books and movies, but it wasn't just fiction. This brutal punishment was very real. While some captains used it as a theatrical form of execution, most pirates weren't that patient, preferring to simply throw their victims overboard without ceremony. One of the earliest known references to walking the plank dates back to 1663, when Dutch sailor Jan Erasmus Reyning reportedly witnessed pirate captain François L'Olonnais forcing Spanish prisoners to their watery graves off the coast of Venezuela. Lolonais, infamous for his sadistic nature, found amusement in watching his victims splash into shark-infested waters, ensuring their suffering didn't end with the fall. Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, one of history's most successful pirates, also used the plank as a public spectacle. In 1720, after capturing the slave ship Samuel off the coast of Newfoundland, Roberts had the crew walk the plank, leaving behind a chilling memory for the ship's captain, William Snellgrave, who later described the ordeal as a most horrid spectacle. Though Roberts had a pirate code that included democratic principles like allowing every crew member a say in important matters, punishments were severe. Desertion or theft could lead to marooning or even death. The infamous plank wasn't confined to the Caribbean or the Atlantic. Pirates in other parts of the world also used this method to deal with rivals or rebellious crew members. In the early 19th century, the fearsome Cheng Wan Sao, also known as Qing Shi, ruled the South China Sea with a fleet of hundreds of ships and thousands of pirates. Her strict code of conduct kept her crew in line, but she had no mercy for enemies. Many were forced to walk the plank, reinforcing her fearsome reputation. Though the phrase "walking the plank" didn't appear in print until the early 19th century, first recorded in Francis Grose's 1796 Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, it had already been in practice for centuries. By 1769, even rebellious sailors were adopting the method. That year, the mutinous crew of the British merchant ship Betsy forced their captain and 2 officers to walk the plank. Miraculously, the victims clung to floating debris and were later rescued, a rare escape from what was usually a guaranteed death sentence. One of the last recorded instances occurred in 1822, when Spanish pirate Benito de Soto captured the Morning Star near Ascension Island. Rather than executing the passengers and crew outright, he made them walk the plank, marking one of the final times this gruesome practice was documented. By then, piracy was on the decline as naval powers cracked down on pirate activity, bringing an end to the so-called golden age of piracy. Walking the plank may have been exaggerated in popular culture, but it was far from a myth. Whether used as a fear tactic or a method of execution, it remains one of the most infamous punishments associated with pirates, an enduring symbol of their ruthless world. Terror of the Spanish tickler. Pirates were infamous for their brutality, but few punishments matched the sheer horror of the Spanish tickler. Despite its misleadingly playful name, this device was designed to inflict unimaginable pain. It was nothing more than a set of sharp, curved iron claws. Yet in the hands of a torturer, it became a tool of pure agony. Flesh wasn't simply cut. It was torn, shredded, and peeled away in strips, leaving victims in unbearable suffering. The process was slow and deliberate. Victims were often restrained, unable to move as the torturer dragged the jagged claws across their skin. Unlike quick deaths by sword or gunshot, the tickler ensured long, drawn-out suffering. It could slice through muscle, sometimes even exposing bone. Many victims bled out, succumbed to infection, or simply perished from the unbearable shock. Though its name suggests Spanish origins, similar devices were used across Europe, proving that torture wasn't confined to a single region. The mere sight of the tickler was often enough to break a prisoner's resolve before it was even used. Fear was its greatest weapon. Many captives confessed to crimes they hadn't committed just to avoid its touch. The psychological torment was just as effective as the physical pain. While pirates didn't frequently carry such devices aboard their ships, stories of its horrors spread across the seas. Sailors whispered tales of captured men being subjected to the tickler in enemy hands, their bodies left mangled beyond recognition. The fear of enduring such a fate was often enough to deter mutiny or keep a crew in line. Even notorious captains knew that if they were ever caught by the wrong people, they could face punishments far worse than the noose. One of the most disturbing aspects of the tickler was its versatility. It wasn't restricted to a single method of use. Some victims were strung up in public, their flesh flayed in front of onlookers, while others were tortured in dungeons, their screams echoing off the stone walls. In some cases, the torturer wouldn't even break the skin at first, choosing instead to rake the claws lightly over the body to instill terror before finally tearing into the flesh. The legend of the Spanish tickler endured for centuries, a symbol of the darkest side of human cruelty. Whether on land or at sea, the mere mention of it was enough to make even the toughest pirate think twice before falling into enemy hands. Keelhauling. If there was one punishment sailors feared the most, it was keel hauling. This gruesome ordeal involved tying a sailor's feet, dragging them under the ship's hull, and pulling them from one side to the other. Covered in sharp barnacles, the keel turned the victim's body into a bloody mess, leaving survival unlikely. If the jagged shells didn't rip them apart, drowning often finished the job. Keel hauling wasn't just a pirate's trick. It actually originated in the Dutch Navy in the 17th century. The term itself comes from the Dutch word kalen, meaning to haul under the keel. The Dutch, known for their strict naval discipline, used this terrifying punishment to keep sailors in line. One of the earliest recorded cases was in 1622 when a Dutch sailor named Pilgrim Willem was keel-hauled for striking his captain. The process itself was as painful as it was humiliating. The condemned man would be stripped and bound with ropes, sometimes weighted to ensure he sank. Then the crew would haul him across the keel, dragging him through the barnacle-crusted hull beneath the ship. The damage was devastating: deep cuts, broken bones, and severe trauma. If he didn't drown outright, he might die later from infections caused by the filthy, saltwater-soaked wounds. Though keel hauling was most commonly associated with the Dutch, other navies also used it. The Russians under Tsar Peter the Great in the 18th century adopted the practice and saw it as an effective method of discipline. The British, however, generally looked down on keel hauling, calling it un-English, although there were reports of unofficial cases. The French rejected it outright, considering it far too cruel. Interestingly, pirates rarely resorted to keel hauling. They usually preferred quicker, more straightforward punishments like marooning or forcing disobedient crew members to walk the plank. However, the mere threat of keel hauling was often enough to keep men in check. No one wanted to face such a brutal fate. By the 18th century, voices of opposition grew louder. French philosopher Montesquieu condemned keel hauling in the spirit of the laws, calling it contrary to humanity. Despite the criticism, the Dutch Navy continued using it into the 19th century. The last known official case happened in 1853, causing public outrage that finally led to its abolition. Keel hauling may have disappeared, but its legacy remains one of the most horrifying punishments in naval history, a reminder of just how ruthless life at sea could be. Branding. Branding has been around for centuries, and while many people associate it with marking livestock, its use on humans has a long and brutal history. From criminals and slaves to sailors and pirates, branding wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was a permanent mark of shame, ownership, or punishment. The process was as cruel as it sounds. A metal brand was heated until it was red hot, then pressed against the skin, searing a lasting scar that served as a lifelong reminder of one's past. For sailors and pirates, branding carried a particularly heavy weight. It wasn't just about the physical pain, it was about being publicly marked as a criminal or traitor. A branded man couldn't hide his past, and his scar served as a warning to others. Those who tried to desert or defy their captain could find themselves permanently labeled, ensuring they would never escape their reputation. The idea was to deter others from similar actions by making an example out of the branded individual. Movies like Pirates of the Caribbean have popularized branding as part of pirate lore. Captain Jack Sparrow, for instance, carries a P brand, marking him as a pirate in the eyes of the East India Company. While it makes for dramatic storytelling, the reality was even harsher. Branding was often used in English courts during the late 1600s and early 1700s, typically as a way to punish those who had escaped execution. Criminals who were spared the noose might instead receive a brand on their hand or thumb, a permanent mark that ensured everyone knew their past crimes. Beyond criminals, branding was also used to control enslaved people. Slave owners would brand their slaves to assert dominance and ownership, making escape nearly impossible. If a slave was caught after attempting to flee, they could be flogged and branded again, this time as a warning to others. The scars were meant to strip away any sense of identity, reducing a person to nothing more than property. On pirate ships, branding wasn't always an official punishment, but it was an effective one. Captains who wanted to maintain control could use it as a way to keep their crew in line. A branded pirate couldn't easily blend in with society, making it difficult to escape the life of crime. Some pirates, however, took on branding voluntarily, using it as a way to show loyalty to their crew or prove their toughness. In reality, the law was sometimes more complicated than Hollywood portrays. In Pirates of the Caribbean, Captain Norrington discovers Jack Sparrow's brand and immediately orders him to be hanged. But historically, a branding mark often meant a pirate had already been spared execution once. Without evidence of new crimes, authorities wouldn't have been able to carry out a death sentence based on an old brand alone. Instead, they might exile or imprison the individual. Branding was more than just a punishment. It was a tool of fear, control, and identity. Whether used by governments, slave traders, or pirates, its purpose was always the same: to leave a permanent mark, both on the body and the mind. Hanging. If there was one fate pirates dreaded above all, it was hanging. By the end of the golden age of piracy, this had become the standard punishment for captured pirates, carried out swiftly after a trial. But these executions weren't just about justice. They were a warning to anyone even thinking about a life of piracy. The authorities made sure they were as public and as gruesome as possible, choosing locations where sailors would be forced to see the consequences firsthand. In London, Execution Dock in Wapping became infamous for these hangings. Located right along the River Thames, it was the perfect place to remind mariners of the price of piracy. When anti-piracy campaigns were in full swing, entire crews were sentenced together, their deaths serving as a grim spectacle. Prisoners were marched from places like Newgate or Marshalsea, led by an officer carrying a silver oar, a symbol of the High Court of the Admiralty's authority. Execution Dock itself was a simple yet terrifying setup. The condemned men stood on a wooden scaffold near the river while a chaplain gave them a final prayer. They were allowed to speak their last words, which were often recorded and shared with the public. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The pirate would be pushed off the ladder, left to hang. But unlike modern executions designed for a quick death, these hangings rarely snapped the neck. Instead, the pirates suffered a slow and painful strangulation, their bodies twitching as the crowd watched. But the punishment didn't end there. Once the execution was done, the authorities made sure the message lasted. The bodies were left tied to wooden posts or staked out on the beach, exposed to the elements for 3 full tides before being tossed into an unmarked grave. For the most infamous pirates, even death wasn't the end of their suffering. Captains and high-profile figures were often placed in iron cages, gibbets, where their tarred corpses would be left to rot in full view of passing ships. One of the most well-known cases was Captain William Kidd, who was executed in 1701. After being hanged in London, his body was coated in tar and displayed in a cage by the River Thames for 2 years. It was a horrifying sight, meant to make sailors think twice before choosing the pirate's life. This practice wasn't exclusive to London. Across the Atlantic, in Jamaica, John Rackham, better known as Calico Jack, was hanged in 1720. His body was then placed in a cage at Deadman's Cay in Port Royal as a brutal reminder. A year later, Charles Vane, another notorious pirate, met the same fate. The authorities wanted pirates to know that capture meant not only death, but public humiliation even in the afterlife. Even before execution, pirates knew what awaited them if caught. Take the case of Blackbeard, the legendary Edward Teach. In 1718, he was shot 5 times and slashed with swords more than 20 times before finally falling. His head was then severed and mounted on the prow of Lieutenant Maynard's ship as a warning to all who saw it. Some pirates, like Bartholomew Roberts, were so determined to avoid such a fate that they ordered their men to dispose of their bodies at sea. When Roberts was killed in battle in February 1722, his crew followed his wishes, ensuring he never ended up hanging in a cage. But for many others, their remains were left on display for years. The bodies of hanged pirates were sometimes coated in tar to slow decomposition or placed inside iron cages to hold them together as they rotted. A particularly eerie example was John Breads, a murderer hanged in Rye, East Sussex, in 1743. His body remained suspended in a gibbet for over 20 years, his skull still trapped within the iron frame. The remains of this horrifying cage can still be seen in Rye's Town Hall today. Another chilling relic from this era is the gibbet iron on display at the Atwater Kent Museum in Philadelphia. It was built in 1781 for a pirate named Thomas Wilkinson, though he was never executed. A similar iron cage can still be viewed at the Westgate Museum in Winchester, a grim reminder of how justice was once served. Hanging may have been the most common punishment for pirates, but the real horror was what came after. These public displays weren't just about eliminating criminals. They were carefully staged performances meant to strike fear into every sailor who saw them. And for many, that fear was enough to keep them from ever hoisting the black flag. Marooning. Breaking the pirate code came at a steep price, and one of the cruelest punishments was marooning. If a pirate was caught stealing treasure or betraying his crew, he wasn't just thrown overboard. He was left stranded on a deserted island, completely at the mercy of nature. No food, no water, and no way back. Just a bottle of rum, a pistol, and a handful of gunpowder, enough to either prolong the suffering or take the easy way out. This brutal practice dates back to the 1700s, and its name likely comes from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning runaway or wild. Pirates had a dark sense of humor about it, referring to the punishment as being made governor of an island. But in reality, it was usually a slow, agonizing death. Few ever made it out alive, but there were exceptions. In 1720, pirate Captain Edward England and his men were marooned on a desolate island in the Indian Ocean. Against all odds, they survived for 4 months, eventually building a boat and making their way to Madagascar. Another case was Robert Jeffrey, a sailor marooned by the British Navy in 1807. Unlike most, he was lucky. An American ship rescued him, and the officer responsible for his punishment was later dismissed. But perhaps the most legendary marooning story belongs to Alexander Selkirk. Left alone on an island off the coast of Chile, after a dispute with his captain, he managed to survive for 4 years. His incredible tale of resilience became the inspiration for Robinson Crusoe, proving that sometimes even the cruelest punishments couldn't break the human spirit. Whipping with the cat o' nine tails. If you've ever heard the phrase, letting the cat out of the bag, you might not know that its origins trace back to one of the most feared punishments at sea, the cat o' nine tails. This wasn't just any whip. It was a cruel instrument of discipline, made up of 9 knotted cords designed to tear into flesh with every strike. Some versions were even more horrifying, with fish hooks or musket balls tied to the ends to make each lash even more unbearable. For those unfortunate enough to feel its sting, the pain wasn't just excruciating, it was often fatal. Pirates weren't the only ones who used this brutal punishment. The British Royal Navy and merchant vessels also relied on it to enforce discipline. The whip was typically stored in a bag, and when it was time for a flogging, it was taken out, leading to the now common phrase about letting the cat out of the bag. On pirate ships, punishment was often swift and severe. Take John Phillips, the infamous captain of the Revenge. His crew knew that breaking the pirate code could mean 39 lashes, a number known as Moses' Law, believed to be the maximum a person could endure and survive. Some victims took more, but many didn't live to tell the tale. What made things even worse was that the whip was rarely cleaned. It often carried the blood, flesh, and filth of previous punishments, turning every strike into a potential death sentence due to infection. The cat o' nine tails wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of fear. Naval historian Enum Roger called it the voice of naval discipline, a language every seaman understood. And indeed, every sailor, pirate or not, dreaded the moment they heard the order for flogging. The crew would be called to gather and watch, ensuring that everyone learned the lesson. The unfortunate victim was tied to a mast or grating, their back exposed for the blows to come. A ship's surgeon would be present, but not necessarily to help, just to determine whether the man could survive the punishment or if it needed to stop before death. The wounds left by the cat o' nine tails weren't just painful, they were gruesome. Each cord made of raw hide or thin rope would shred the skin with every strike, leaving deep, bloody welts. The name cat o' nine tails likely came from the fact that the injuries resembled the scratch marks of a wild cat, or from the superstition that a cat had 9 lives. Though victims of this punishment often weren't that lucky, flogging had long been a part of maritime discipline, becoming officially sanctioned by the British Royal Navy in 1661 under the Articles of War. It wasn't reserved for only the worst crimes. Offenses as minor as drunkenness or disobedience could earn a sailor a whipping, while more serious infractions like theft or mutiny warranted extreme lashings. The number of strokes varied widely, often left to the captain's discretion. Some, like Commodore James Barron, handed out unimaginable sentences. One sailor, Robert Jeffrey, was ordered to endure 500 lashes in 1812. He survived, but many others weren't as fortunate. In 1731, a man named John Barrell was also sentenced to 500 lashes for desertion. He lasted 3 days before succumbing to his injuries. Beyond the physical pain, the psychological toll of flogging was just as devastating. Admiral John Jarvis, Earl of St. Vincent, once said, "Discipline is preserved in a ship by the dread of punishment." That fear was real. When a flogging was announced, the crew stood in silence, forced to watch as the lesson was delivered. And the suffering didn't end when the beating stopped. Wounds were treated with brine or vinegar, a method that wasn't about healing, but ensuring infection didn't set in too quickly. Sailor Jack Nastiface recalled in his memoirs how a flogged man's wounds were dressed with pickles, adding another layer of misery. Even after surviving the lashes, it could be weeks before a sailor could wear a shirt again without pain. Not every captain was quick to use the lash. Captain William Bligh of Mutiny on the Bounty fame was relatively restrained, preferring punishments like confinement or reduced rations. Captain James Cook also limited floggings, favoring discipline without excessive cruelty. By the 19th century, public sentiment was turning against flogging. Writers like Charles Dickens and Herman Melville condemned the practice, leading to gradual reforms. In 1850, the U.S. Navy restricted floggings to 12 lashes, and by 1862, they were abolished entirely. The British Royal Navy followed in 1879, though they still retained the punishment for mutiny until 1881. The cat o' nine tails may have been a feared instrument of punishment for centuries, but its eventual ban marked a turning point in naval discipline. Even so, the scars, both physical and psychological, left by this cruel tool lived on in the memories of those who suffered beneath it. The next time you hear someone let the cat out of the bag, remember that, once upon a time, those words carried a far darker meaning. Pirates ruled the seas with fear, but their punishments were even more terrifying. Which of these brutal methods shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more thrilling history.